AM Media Day 2025.
Hola, muy buenos días. Les damos la más cordial bienvenida a la segunda versión del Seminario de Marketing y Medios AM Media Day. Este encuentro, organizado por AM, Asociación de Agencias de Medios Chile, es una iniciativa que en esta, su versión 2025, busca poner en valor el marketing aportando evidencia empírica que avala que la gestión del marketing, la publicidad, los medios y las comunicaciones comerciales en general son una inversión y no un gasto. Este encuentro reúne a los más destacados profesionales del marketing y la publicidad en Chile y es la posibilidad de compartir experiencias recientes en mercados donde esta actividad ha alcanzado mayor desarrollo, todo ello a partir de las ponencias de destacados conferencistas de nivel internacional. Pero no podemos iniciar la jornada sin mencionar a quienes han hecho posible esta iniciativa. En primer lugar, agradecemos a todas las empresas asociadas de AM, también a los auspiciadores, apoyos y media partners de este seminario, Chilevisión, Prisa Media, DF, Cencosud Media, JC Deco, RDF Media, Warner Bros, Discovery, Walmart, Connect, Kantar y Bob Media, Logan, Ziptac, Cosmos, CMS, Instor Media, AIM, ANDA, Cámara de Comercio de Santiago y Valora. Hechas las menciones y para comenzar dejo con ustedes al presidente de AM y director de Abbas Media Network, Gonzalo Parra. Gonzalo, por favor, bienvenido.
Wow. La verdad es que estoy tremendamente orgulloso, emocionado y honrado de estar esta noche, parece noche, ¿no? Pero la verdad es que la mañana, ¿no? Vamos a hacer esto una fiesta. Partí todo mal, ¿no? Tremendo día, tremendo orgullo estar aquí esta mañana compartiendo con ustedes. Más de 600 personas, ¿no? Más de 600 personas que nos acompañan hoy día. Y la verdad es que en nombre del directorio no podría partir de otra forma, sino que agradeciéndole a cada uno de los socios, a los directores, a los aliados estratégicos, a los auspiciadores que hacen posible que esta mañana estemos aquí reunidos. Si no fuera por los auspiciadores, este tipo de contenido no sería posible. Pero no sería posible también si no estuvieran todos ustedes, los asistentes, las más de 600 personas que están hoy día aquí, porque hoy día ustedes son quienes hacen posible que celebremos esta mañana de marketing, esta mañana de un tremendo encuentro de la industria publicitaria de Chile. Muy bien, así que primero que nada, muchísimas gracias. Pero si bien hoy día esto se trata de un seminario de marketing y de medios, para nosotros como asociación es mucho más que eso. Para nosotros como asociación es una oportunidad para poder primero poner en pie el rol del marketing, pero además significar también el rol que tenemos, el rol estratégico que tenemos las agencias de medios en el mercado chileno. Ese rol de poder ayudar y compartir, colaborar con el crecimiento de las marcas, el crecimiento de los negocios, con la capacidad de poder conectar a los consumidores con las marcas, de poder entregar datos de valor para poder tomar decisiones, de poder entregar resultados medibles por cada inversión que se realiza. Y tiene nuestro compromiso de que como industria vamos a seguir trabajando y colaborando para evolucionar y asegurar que cada peso invertido tenga impacto, tenga propósito y evidentemente también tenga retorno. Además de eso, ya lo mencionaron, hoy día estamos acá reunidos porque lo que queremos es que realmente se entienda de que el marketing es una inversión y no es un gasto, que es una inversión para el crecimiento de largo plazo sostenido de las marcas. Y hoy día lo que esperamos es que nuestros grandes speakers que vamos a tener hoy día puedan poner en evidencia que realmente el marketing es eso, es una inversión y no un gasto. Quiero compartir también con ustedes que nosotros, la Asociación de Agencias de Medios, es una asociación gremial que lo que busca es poder colaborar, dialogar y por sobre todo poner el bien común en la industria por sobre los intereses individuales de cada uno de los socios que estamos en esta asociación. Quiero también contarles que la Asociación de Agencias de Medios tiene más de 10 años en la industria y que actualmente administra más del 80% de la inversión publicitaria del mercado chileno. Por esa razón, no es casualidad de que hoy día estemos organizando este seminario de marketing y de medios. Y también les puedo asegurar que tienen mi compromiso y el compromiso de todo el directorio de que vamos a ir trabajando para poder aportar todos los meses con información relevante para la industria. Información relevante como ya lo hacemos, quienes pueden entrar al sitio web de la Asociación de Agencias de Medios ya lo han hecho, ese informe de inversión publicitaria que entregamos todos los meses. Que además les contamos una novedad, hace un par de meses atrás ya lanzamos al mercado el nuevo software de la asociación que es capaz hoy día de procesar más datos, más información y entregar información realmente única y relevante para la industria y que esta mañana ya nos contarán una sorpresa que tenemos y que va a ser, creo que de gran valor para toda la industria, la nueva información que les vamos a poder entregar al mercado. Quiero contarles también que en términos más amplios, sabemos de nuestra responsabilidad de poner en valor el servicio de cada uno de nuestros asociados. El valor en términos del uso de los datos, la digitalización. Encuentros como este que tienen que ver con la formación y capacitación de nuestros profesionales, pero también de aportar valor en términos de conocimiento a la industria. Como así también de entregar información relevante o de integrar inteligencia artificial, por supuesto, en la planificación y compra de medios. Como también automatizar cada uno de los reportes y toda la información que sea relevante para la toma de decisiones. Cada una de esta información que nos permita a todos como industria entregar, aportar más información para poder conseguir mejores resultados. Como se pueden dar cuenta, no son pocos los frentes en los cuales estamos trabajando como asociación y como industria, como esta industria de las comunicaciones comerciales, para poder, en primer lugar, conectar a las marcas con los consumidores de manera significativa. Y en segundo lugar, para asegurar de que en realidad podamos poner valor en la inversión que realiza cada uno de los anunciantes en los medios. Tienen nuestro compromiso de que vamos a ir trabajando en conjunto para que cada uno de estos desafíos los podamos alcanzar. Muchísimas gracias. Y muy bien, esto es como los recados parroquiales. Información muy relevante que quiero compartir con ustedes. Quiero aprovechar esta instancia para poder dar una noticia que nos tiene muy orgullosos y que a partir del 1 de abril, hoy día en la asociación, tenemos una nueva y una tremenda profesional liderando como gerente general la Asociación de Agencias de Medios. Les queremos agradecer también a quien fue el antecesor, que es Diego Badí, pero hoy día queremos reconocer y agradecer a Gema Berríos como nuestra nueva gerente general. Gema, para quienes no lo saben, es una mujer que lleva una tremenda trayectoria en la industria. Trabajó en empresas como Omnicom, recientemente fue la directora general de Publicis Media, ha compartido y colaborado en la asociación por más de 12 años y fue también nuestra vicepresidenta en el último periodo. Les quiero pedir que recibamos aquí en el escenario con un tremendo y caluroso aplauso a Gema Berríos. Bienvenida.
Gracias, muchas gracias. Gracias a todos por la bienvenida. Gracias por la confianza que el directorio tuvo en mí para tomar el rol. Estoy feliz de estar en la asociación y de seguir construyendo la industria desde otra vereda, no solo en las agencias, sino con las universidades que van a ser también los futuros líderes que vamos a tener desde nuestros avisadores y además desde las agencias de medios y las otras empresas que conforman también nuestra asociación. Tenemos un momento muy emotivo, muy solemne también, que quisimos agregar dentro de lo que es el Media Day para este nuevo año y para los que vienen también. Tenemos una conmemoración, perdón, no es este. Gracias. Tenemos una presentación bajo el contexto de darle las gracias a las personas que han hecho una trayectoria empresarial, y para eso tenemos dos reconocimientos hoy en día. Se trata de un reconocimiento, una iniciativa más bien, una forma de honrar y valorar el compromiso y esmero que han dedicado las personas durante toda su carrera a construir y fortalecer una empresa o marca. No solo es un gesto de aprecio, sino también sirve para motivar a otros y reforzar los valores de una organización. Nuestra primera homenajeada es ingeniero civil industrial y MBA, con amplia experiencia en altos cargos ejecutivos en el área de marketing, planificación comercial y negocios de conveniencia e inversiones. Entre sus grandes logros, destaca haber construido equipos de alto rendimiento, con énfasis en la excelencia, foco en el cliente y desarrollo de las personas, así como líder de proyectos y el desarrollo de productos con probado aporte de valor a la marca y a la compañía. Fueron más de 28 años en Empresas Copec. Su exitosa trayectoria la llevaron a convertirse en su gerenta de marketing. Hoy es directora de Arco Prime, con más de 450 tiendas Pronto y tiendacopec.cl. También es directora de Chile Tour, guías turísticas chilenas distribuidas en Copec. Una carrera que sin duda la hace merecedora de esta distinción. Recibamos con un fuerte aplauso a Gloria Lederman. Hace entrega de este reconocimiento nuestra vicepresidenta de la asociación, Carla Quintero Bonilla.
¿Qué pasaste, Felipe?
Gracias. Foto. Gracias. Nuestro segundo profesional distinguido es publicista de profesión. Por más de 30 años lideró los equipos de marketing y publicidad de Banco Santander Chile, con foco en la creación de valor, desarrollo de productos y servicios, resultando comerciales, branding y posicionamiento de marca. Entre sus destacados logros está haber trasladado el lenguaje del retail a la banca, con ofertas estacionales, siempre innovando, junto a su equipo de trabajo, en llevar las campañas del banco no por el lado del producto y servicio, sino por el de la relación de la marca con las personas. Y consiguió un exitoso resultado a la hora de acoplar una marca global con el trabajo corporativo local. Fue reconocido como mejor gerente de marketing en el Marketing Best del 2013. Y actualmente se desempeña como consultor de marketing estratégico. Una dilatada trayectoria que lo convierten en un acreedor de esta distinción. Invitamos a este escenario a Paulo Molina. Hace entrega del conocimiento Marcela Robledo, directora de nuestra asociación. Felicidades. Todos, por favor, acérquense. Muchas gracias. ¿Quieres decir algo? Dejo con ustedes a nuestra maestra de ceremonia.
Bueno, agradecemos la participación de los representantes de AM que nos acompañaron en el escenario y de manera especial, ¿cierto?, volvemos a felicitar a Gloria Lederman y Paulo Molina que recibieron este importante reconocimiento. Un último aplauso, por favor. Bueno, y de esta forma entramos de lleno a lo que nos convoca esta mañana. Paso a presentarles al primer expositor de esta jornada. Él es asesor financiero de la Bolsa de Londres y ha sido elegido 2 veces analista del año de City IM. Cuenta con más de 20 años de experiencia y es ampliamente reconocido en la industria por su entendimiento en cuanto a medios digital y comunicaciones. Destacan su asertividad en la identificación de tendencias, conocimiento de la dinámica de la industria y sus implicaciones para las empresas, tanto como su comprensión de tendencias macroeconómicas, políticas y sociales para consultoría estratégica y financiera. Ian Whittaker es fundador y director general de Liberty Sky Advisors, portavoz y comentarista de medios de comunicación, columnista y editor en lo que respecta a medios, tecnologías e industrias relacionadas. Dejo con ustedes a Ian Whittaker. Ian, por favor.
Good morning, everyone. Very, very nice to be here in Chile, and it's an honor to be down here speaking to you all. So, just before we start the presentation, I just want to say sort of a few words. We'll put things in context, both in terms of the angle sort of from where sort of my comments will come from, and then also as well just in terms of the general environment and where we are at the moment. My background is I've never worked for an advertising company before, never worked in marketing. My background is finance, and I did that for over 20 years, dealt with numbers, and now I advise of many agencies and advertisers on how they should actually speak and communicate their message to the CFOs and CEOs of their companies. Because one thing that actually started to realize when I was working with advertisers and agencies was that they had a great if you want to put it, great content. As we'll go into the slides later, advertising is absolutely crucial to the profitability and the future success of firms. But they just weren't getting the message across in the right way. And often that came down to a matter of communication. And so one of the things that I want to do within this presentation is give a few ideas as to how perhaps so that the industry can get its message across more succinctly and better. The second thing to say, and this is from a general environment, and what's happening is and I'll call myself for the purpose of this an outsider, when you look from an outsider's perspective, there is a great opportunity for advertising at the moment, and there's a great risk. The opportunity actually comes in the form that the world is changing, and for many companies are uncertain as to where their position is and how they relate to consumers. Consumers themselves are also changing as well, but for many companies, they face an environment, geopolitical, macroeconomic, but also as well what's happening in different forms of media that is fast changing, and they find it hard to understand. Advertising can be central to helping them with that. The risk is that advertising becomes commoditized. And I'm sure many of you have seen the comments last week from Mark Zuckerberg on the financial results for Meta, where essentially was talking about the commodification of advertising content, that essentially Meta will now produce your ads and will sell your ads. The logic of that is you don't need a creative agency. You don't really need sort of media planners. And Facebook will do it all for you. And one of the things that I think the industry needs to realize is that message, even though from an advertising perspective you may look at it and say, how can that be true? How is it that that you can get to a world where Meta can use AI ads? How is that even possible? Bear in mind that is a message that is going to be very, very attractive to many CEOs and CFOs who are going to be looking to reduce their costs. Because at the end of the day, from their perspective, this is all about numbers. So, I'd like to actually start off this and maybe a bit of a reversal. We all talk about, and I do, sort of why advertisers and agencies need to understand the language of the CEO and the CFO and communicate their message better. But actually, I would argue that CEOs, chief financial officers, absolutely crucial that they understand what advertising does. The next time somebody comes and says, well, how is it that advertising is just a cost? Prove to me that it actually improves sales. We actually have a very solid real-life example from 2 or 3 years ago. The great inflationary crisis of 2022 to 2024. When I listened to many company conference calls, sort of around May, June of 2022, companies were saying very much the same thing. We're suddenly facing a huge increase in input costs. There is no way, according to our models, that we can pass these costs through to our consumers without there being a massive impact on volume. And they were all panicking about the impact that would have on their firms. And yet, 18 months later, they were not only passing through those costs and more to the consumers, but there was very, very little impact on their volume. And every single conference call that I listened to as to why, sort of when CEOs and CFOs were explaining why that was the case, they pointed to one factor: the strength of their brands. It was the strength of their brands that had enabled them to push through those price increases to the consumers. This is a chart from Unilever. The light blue is in terms of the pricing growth. The sort of dark blue is volume growth, and then you have the overall sales growth on there. You can see during the height of inflation that they were putting through price increases far in excess of what had gone on before, and actually with little impact to volume. If you want a single slide that proves how advertising and marketing contributes to the profitability of firms, this would be it on there. However, there are more slides. And it's a related point. This is from Conagra. It's a chart sort of looking at their price elasticities. The thing to look at it is, if you look at the green charts, very, very significant price increases coming through. You look in terms of price sensitivity, sort of in terms of the impact on volumes, hardly any change. Again, it was the strength of brands that enabled that. But also as well, if you take a step back and look at the wider economy, this is looking at US corporate profits. So the time 2001 to 2024. Yet the line to look at it is the blue line on there. You can see there, sort of from 2022 to 2024, US corporates, just in 4 years, have doubled their corporate profitability. What was the key driver of that? The key driver of that for many of them was because they were able to put through significant price increases to their consumers. And as actually their input costs in many cases declined, those prices still remained high. Therefore, what they did was increase their margins. So again, we have another example here of how advertising is absolutely crucial to profitability. Now, I like to sort of, this is a little bit more of a conceptual sort of view, but I like to call advertising as intangible capex. What do I mean by that? Well, you think about physical capex. Companies realize that, for example, if you're building cars, you need to build a car factory, you need investment, but the long-term sort of benefits of that is that you boost your sales. It's the same also as well when it comes to advertising. It needs investing, it needs nurturing, but essentially the end result, if you do it well, will be, again, increased sales and profitability. But like CapEx, like a physical factory, you can't just build it and then leave it alone. Anyone, you own a house, you don't have to own a factory sort of with your own homes, you'll realize if you don't maintain your house, eventually it falls apart. The cost of those repairs are often greater than the cost of maintenance. And it's the same sort of thing with advertising. This is from looking at Temu, in terms of when they turned off Google Ads recently, what happened in terms of the ranking on Google App Play Store. It collapsed. They didn't have any brand. They were being kept up by constant marketing. The moment that fell off, that was it. You need the brand to actually they don't really have a strong brand, but you need the brand to maintain things. Now, I don't know how many people know the figure on the left-hand side, he's just stepped down, that's Warren Buffett. The reason why I actually mentioned Warren Buffett in this slide is that Warren Buffett made 99% of his wealth after the age of 51. Yet, what's the point of that? Well, what it does show is the power of compound. This whole idea, if you think about, for example, in a bank, when you put your money in, you let it continue to grow. It doesn't have to grow that much every year, but as long as it consistently and solidly is continued, it will grow into a large amount. Same when it comes to advertising. I put the numbers on the right-hand side just simply to say that I think when it comes to advertising, and one of the issues that CFOs, or the marketing industry has with CFOs and CEOs in trying to explain their message, is that many CFOs in particular will look at brand advertising on the top. And they'll say, okay, I need to save some costs. So what will I do? The easiest way to do it is to cut my marketing costs. And it's absolutely fine. Let's say in that third year, I take that down from 2 to 1. I haven't really changed that much in the overall outcome. All it's done is gone from 8 to 7 in terms of the calculation. But actually, when you look at it in terms of brand advertising, what it relies on is that principle of compound. It builds upon what has gone on in the past. And like with anything where you have a compound effect, you need to maintain it in order to keep its strength going. And what I would argue is actually that brand advertising is very much like the bottom of there, that it builds upon each other. And if you cut just in 1 year, thinking that you're going to get a short-term saving, the actual effect that you will have on your longer-term value is going to be a lot greater than you anticipated. And moreover, in order to get back to the same point that you would have been if you maintained your spend, you're going to have to spend a lot more. And so, cutting advertising is really a false economy. And often why advertising gets cut is because CEOs and CFOs believe, the financial markets like it. People like me would have liked it if they cut marketing spend to keep their profitability. But that's not the case. Actually, quite the opposite. This is a survey that I did with the IPA in the UK around 18 months ago. We asked financial analysts and investors how they rated firms and what were the most important characteristics. The most important characteristic was the strength of brand and marketing. So on top there, 79%, far ahead of even profits, which was only at 71% on there. So actually, the financial markets realize that you need brand strength as well. So, I said at the beginning that there's an opportunity here for advertising, and particularly in where we are now. Well, why is that the case? Well, the world has changed. Very much. For those of a certain age may remember the figures on the left-hand side, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. Their view of the world dominated for 50 years. Free trade, globalization, very much open borders, government should get out of the way, businesses know best. That world has gone. Yeah, it's not coming back in 5 years or 10 years. These sorts of changes that you get in the macro order tend to go in cycles of several decades. And so we're very much in a world sort of more on the right-hand side, which I'm sure everyone recognizes that figure, which is very much now everyone is thinking about sort of bringing businesses back to their own country. You've got tariffs, you've got to deal with the effects of those. But also as well, we're facing a world where essentially prices are going to be permanently higher moving forwards. Again, we got used to a world because of those features where inflation, maybe not in certain parts of the world, but certainly in the economies of North America and Western Europe, inflation was running at 0 to 1% for many years. That again has gone. We're probably now going to be more of a baseline of 2 to 3% moving forwards. But even those small changes on a compound effect mean that companies are increasingly going to have to put through price increases to their consumers every single year to maintain profitability. That is a different dynamic. You're already seeing in many countries that the consumer is pushing back. And that's before you get the effects of tariffs. Again, tariffs, you have to you're going to have to persuade your consumers, your customers, to actually buy more goods because the cost of those goods is going up. Now, how does advertising help with that? Well, what I would argue is essentially, comes back to the point that I said before, advertising is central in order to be able to push through those price increases. This is a chart from McDonald's. Again, coming back to that point on US corporate profitability and homing in on McDonald's, you can see there from around 2019 to 2025 just how much their margins have grown. And again, most of that was driven by price increases that they successfully persuaded consumers to accept. And again, if you look at the sort of priorities that CFOs and CFOs are facing, worsening economic conditions, supply constraints, geopolitical tension, and so forth. Again, for CFOs and CEOs, it's a very uncertain world. I would argue that if you can maintain the strength of your brand in this sort of environment, it gives you an advantage over firms who can't. Because what we're facing when it comes to the consumer is in an uncertain world, the consumer starts to think, what do we do now? And like with anything, when they're not feeling confident, when they're fearful of their jobs, when they're fearful about what's going to happen in the wider economy, they hit the pause on their wallet. This is a quote from Burberry. It'll be the stronger brands that consumers, and again, you saw this in the inflationary crisis of 2022 to 24, it'll be the stronger brands where the consumers will say, these are the brands that we need to spend on. And again, when I look at the financial results from companies time and time again, even in a space like luxury, which is facing great pressures at the moment, Hermes does fantastically well. Why? Because consumers say, this is the sort of product that we want to spend on. So again, you are fighting for a share of people's money. And if you have a strong brand, you're in a much better position to take that money. But also as well, I would argue that this brand strength is not something that is essentially goes on forever. It needs to be replenished. Again, come back to this point before about maintenance. It's like a well. You're constantly drawing on that brand strength to push your price increases through. I mentioned McDonald's here because the chart on the right-hand side is just showing in terms of American households and their money. One of the things McDonald's has had to do recently is actually introduce cheaper meal packages and pull back some of its price increases because consumers start to push back against it. Now, I'd argue that one thing that McDonald's did, and indeed many companies have been complacent at, is thinking that because they got through the price increases in 2022 to 2024, that consumers are just willingly going to accept more price increases in the future. That's not the case. Yet consumers, certainly over the past couple of years, are more wary of companies pushing through significant price increases. So again, this is a point you need to replenish your brand strength. Now, I'm going to go back sort of a couple of years on this. This is going to be the example of Procter & Gamble. just a bit of context in this. Procter & Gamble sort of previously was struggling in terms of their sales. If you go back to the mid-2010s, they were significantly behind their peers. Their share price, again, was doing worse than many of their competitors. They weren't getting the sales growth that they needed. In 2017, they completely revitalized their marketing plan. So put more investment in it for sure, but they also turned more to brand strength rather than necessarily performance marketing, became a lot more skeptical of digital. And I'm not saying sort of digital per se sort of is wrong, but what we're saying was there was a feeling that the pendulum had swung too far towards short-term advertising than in building up the brand strength. Now, sort of, I mentioned that 2017 was the year in which Procter & Gamble changed their marketing plans. This is just looking in terms of their value share. You can see sort of as the chart goes on that actually it turns from red, where they were losing share, to actually gains. But also as well, when it came to the financial numbers, what the CFOs and the CEOs are really sort of looking for, because at the end of the day, if you're a CEO and CFO, you don't deliver on the numbers, you will be fired. Also as well, accelerated their top-line growth. I put in pre-COVID just because I wanted to show actually this is not just because of the inflationary effect from price increase is related to COVID. It was actually something that A, was noticeable, because you can see there the previous years, the organic revenue growth has been quite low, but also as well it was sustained. And that also as well led to better profits. Yeah, advertising has a purpose for firms. It is essentially to grow revenues and it is to grow sales. And often the highest margin way to grow your profits is to actually push through price increases. This is a classic example of what happened with Procter & Gamble. Yeah, again, when they actually got better top-line growth, they moved from driving earnings growth that was really driven by cost-cutting in the earlier years to be more being driven by top-line growth in the future years. But, and this is absolutely crucial if you are at the top of the corporate management chain in a listed company, they got a better share price performance. Yeah, this is looking at their peers for the context of this, in case people can't read it. I put it in as Unilever, Nestle, Reckitt Benckiser, and Mondelez. Before their marketing plan took effect, Procter & Gamble was lagging its peers. The moment they started to see that better top-line performance and that better profit growth come through, you can see there they outperformed their peers by 75%. The point I want to make here is that marketing was crucial to their plans. And so the next time a CEO and a CFO says, well, what does marketing do for me? You point out and say, it's not just better numbers, it's a better share price performance as well. Okay, so from a marketing perspective, you're trying to get across sort of some of the points as to how you should sort of communicate to CEO and CFO. What I like to say is that you need to understand their mindset. You need to understand sort of where they're coming from. One thing to bear in mind, people often talk about advertising spend and they'll say, well, it's related to GDP and it's related to how the consumer's feeling. That's not the case. What it's related to is actually corporate profitability. At the end of the day, it's corporates who spend on advertising. This is a chart from German broadcaster ProSieben. They went and looked at their top 1,000 advertisers who were listed on the stock exchange, saw what they did with their advertising spend for those who are on track to meet their numbers and those who are on track to actually miss them. And you can see there that those who are on track to miss them, they cut their advertising spend by 10% on there. So the single biggest factor to look out for is what companies are doing with their profits. And also as well, what you've got to remember is that the actual change rate of management in CEOs and CFOs is increasing all the time. Yeah, it used to be said the average tenure of a CMO was 3 years. Increasingly, that's becoming the case as well for CFO and the CEO. What happens is they tend to have sort of more and more short-term priorities. They're focused on quarterly results. And there is this feeling that they can't think about long-term, or it's a lot harder to think about long-term strategic thinking. So therefore, you've got to realize that in many cases, their thinking is going to be sort of very short-term driven. But I go back to this point before. If CEOs and CFOs don't deliver, then potentially they can get fired. This is the point. If you, for example, US companies report on a quarterly basis, you get a full sort of set of numbers. You know, what happens here, because of that, every company's set of management is looking to the next quarter to deliver. And quite frankly, analysts and investors, they get one set of quarterly results. I mean, I did it. It's exactly the same mindset when I was doing it for 20 years. You get one set of quarterly numbers. The moment that's gone, you're on to the next one. What was actually said before gets forgotten about. So again, these companies have a very, very short-term mindset. Yeah, but they're under a lot of pressure to deliver on the numbers. But this is why it's actually sort of crucial in terms of marketing, why often marketing will get cut when companies need to meet their profits. There are 3 AM for companies. There's the profit and loss, the balance sheet, and the cash flow. The most important from an analyst and a investor standpoint is profit and loss. The other 2 are also important as well, particularly cash. But most people will look in terms of the profit and loss sort of numbers. The issue with marketing is that marketing is treated as operational expenditure, operating costs. So it's 100% expensed in the year in which it occurs. Get on there. That's opposed to, for example, IT. IT is capitalized. Put on the balance sheet, it's written down over a number of years. Now, there's one thing here, sort of one thing that would say is that, there is a perception issue. If you're in operating costs, particularly if you're a CFO, you will see that as a negative. You see operating costs as a negative. You want to minimize them. You don't see them as an investment. You see, essentially, it's something to be controlled, that you can't let sort of spread sort of immensely. If you see it as CapEx, you tend to see it as an investment, and you see it as a long-term issue. There's a different mindset that's involved there. But also as well, if you are a CFO or a CEO that needs to meet your financial forecasts and you need to do it quickly, the easiest way to do it is to cut your advertising spend. So this is an example that would say, okay, what happens if I cut £50 million of marketing spend? What does it do to my profit and loss numbers? And again, bear in mind that's the most important part for analysts and investors. If I cut that 50 million marketing spend, go straight through to profits. It's very quick to do. I can do it instantaneously. I don't necessarily see the effects in sales because it will tend to be something that is more forward-thinking. If I try and cut my IT investment, because the way that the accounting works, I don't get that immediate benefit to my profit and loss. So this is why when firms are under pressure in order to maintain profits, marketing is often the first area that they look at. Because it's quick to cut, it has an immediate effect in terms of numbers, and they don't see the long-term consequences of it. And that is something that you need to think about when you're thinking about how to explain to your CEOs and CFOs and the mindset that they are in when they're thinking about the marketing budget. So what should you do in order to help your CFOs and your CEOs understand why advertising is important? Well, first thing we'll say here, you've actually got very shared goals. You can see here that the numbers, there's a slight difference in terms of marketing is essential for driving profitability, but even 80% plus of CFOs, finance decision makers, realize that. Yet they realize that 75% of them realize there's a key driver of short-term growth. There is a lot here that CMOs and CFOs have actually got in common. And also as well, if you look at it though, there is though a slight difference of this. So again, here we're talking about company priorities for marketing and financial directors. There's some sort of areas where it's the same, improving efficiency, for example, long-term growth, the numbers are the same. But you can see there, for example, a noticeable difference on increasing profitability. One thing I would argue that CMOs need to be sort of people in advertising, what they need to emphasize, what they need to show to people who are making the decisions about their budgets is how advertising actually ties into profitability. Now, hopefully a lot of the slides sort of before showed that, real-life examples of how marketing did that. But if you're going to get through to CEO and the CFO, particularly a CFO, on why they shouldn't cut their advertising spend and actually why they should spend more, think about this. Think about how you can tie in what you do to increasing profitability. But also as well, what I would say, I mean, this is it's just a page for an annual report of a company. It could have been any company. But also as well, you need to understand your company. You need to understand your industry. What I always say to some people in advertising is the best thing for you to do is go and read your company's annual report. Go and listen to the company conference calls when they're reporting to analysts and investors. Why? Because you will understand what are the top priorities for your management. And if you understand what are the top priorities for your management, you can then say, right, in terms of what I do, in terms of advertising and marketing, how can I tie that in to what they see as their top priorities? If you don't understand your companies, though, you don't understand your industries, and you don't understand what's going on in the world, it's very, very hard to do that. So really build up your knowledge here. And you'd be surprised at how much it will be effective if you can tie what you do into what companies are thinking about in terms of what they need to do, how much better it will be that you will get your message across. Now, I also say as well, it's Abraham Lincoln. This is a quote that he said in terms of chopping down a tree. One of the things that sort of find when sort of in the marketing industry is people tend to concentrate on a lot of the outputs. They'll talk about what their model has churned out and what it shows, and shows the ROI. If you spend this is what you get back, and so forth. When I was an analyst, financial analyst, the actual output that I would do, people weren't interested in my output. They weren't interested in the result that I came out with. Why? Because anyone who's the CFO and the CEO will know that you can manipulate any model and produce the outcome that you want. So actually, the result, they're not really focused on the result. What they're really focused on is the detail. They're really focused on the inputs. They're thinking about the thinking. They're thinking about the assumptions you've made. They may not agree with you, but as long as your arguments are solid and they can be defended and they can see the rationale and the process you've gone through, then it makes you look more credible in the eyes of that management. And this, again, sort of is critical. There's a saying in sort of amongst businesses that nobody ever got fired for using McKinsey's. Well, why is that the case? I mean, McKinsey's a very good consultancy firm, but there's been plenty of examples of where they got things wrong. Simple fact is, though, is that when CEOs, sort of management teams use McKinsey's, what they're really buying is confidence. Yeah, and this is the problem that they believe that somebody like a McKinsey's offers a lot of value because of their knowledge. I would argue that this is one of the problems with the marketing industry. Amongst the top-level decision makers, marketing, it just doesn't generate that confidence. And it doesn't generate that confidence because it doesn't get across its message that well. Yeah, if you're talking too much about detail, you're talking about data, everyone likes to bring out their studies in terms of Emberg Bass and all the sort of quantification studies and so forth. But actually, managements can get lost in the data. They haven't got the time to listen to all the data that you're presenting. What they want is a simple message that effectively they have the confidence. I put this picture here for those who sort of, I'm a historian by background. That's a picture of the Vietnam War. The Americans had a strategy in the Vietnam War where they believed that essentially they could look at victory by quantification. That if they could count the numbers would tell everything. And what they found was that was an absolute disastrous strategy because it led them to focus on the wrong priorities. And I would argue in the marketing industry at the moment, there's a lot of that that's happening. People very much focus on the quantification, really drilling down into sort of the latest studies and so forth, and saying that unless we have numbers, unless we can actually sort of prove things by numbers, then that's the only thing that counts. But actually what counts is a narrative. When I was an analyst, the numbers were important. That's absolutely true. But what they supported, and this is the key fact, what they supported was a story, a narrative. You need a narrative when it comes to marketing. That's the one thing that I would argue is missing at the moment. Again, this emphasis too much on quantification. You need a story as to why companies, CEOs, CFOs, should actually spend on marketing. And I would hope that actually the slides before would give you that. The fact that you can actually grow your profitability. Here's a real-life example. This is what it does for the share price. This is what it does for your revenue growth. Get out of the weeds. Focus very much on the story and the message. Final points as well, and I think this is just a sort of general things that I would bear in mind. Again, I'm not a marketer, I'm not an advertiser, I've never worked in the industry, but this is certainly sort of when I worked as a financial analyst, some things that I thought in the context of this industry would be useful. You cannot just think that I produce one report and that's fine, I can leave that for 5 years. You constantly need to update your thinking, your research, the way that you're actually looking at things, also as well reflecting what's happening in the wider world. This is a constant progress. It's not a, here you are, here's a report to your CFO, and then you walk away until the next year. Be thinking about this all the time. I say the point about confidence. No forecast is ever 100% right. Sort of in finance, you will get 25 analysts covering the same company with the same access to the same information, the same guidance, and they will produce 25 different models. Everyone has their own assumptions. That's fine. What's key is that essentially your assumptions are credible, they're strong, and you can defend them. And if you can do all of that, your managements are more likely to listen to you. I mentioned the third point because, and this is sort of go back to what I said at the beginning with Meta, is one of the things to bear in mind with, and again, this is from an outsider's standpoint, there's sort of a bit of a clash going on in the values at the moment. Technology firms, the big tech firms, what they would love to do is reduce advertising to a scientific formula. If you spend X, you will get Y. The reason for that is quite simple. They'll be the winners in that environment. They'll be the ones who generate the most money on there. It's important to push back against that. It's important to say, no, that is not the case. And it is true. Advertising is not a scientific process. It requires creativity. It requires people to think. And the final point. What we'd say here is, for many companies, when they look at things, when they're trying to work out the value of an investment, also as well, they're not just looking for 1, 2, 3 years. I mean, I hear a lot about return on investment. Return on investment is never a metric, or it's very rarely used as a metric in the financial industry to value a company or value an investment. Why? Because it's got a lot of shortcomings. But key to those shortcomings is it very much focuses on the short term rather than long-term value. And again, one thing I would emphasize here in terms of advertising and marketing is don't just relate to sort of show how you sort of benefit the firm in the short term, also show how you benefit them in the long term as well. Thank you very much.
Agradecemos a Ian por su interesante presentación Y las inversiones han sido el centro de la exposición de nuestro primer conferencista, y la Asociación de Agencias de Medios tiene un lugar ganado en la industria a través de la entrega mensual de sus informes de inversión. Para darles una interesante noticia al respecto, dejo con ustedes nuevamente sobre el escenario a Gema Berríos, gerenta general de AM. Recibámosla nuevamente con un aplauso, por favor.
Ahora sí, con la carpeta correcta. Oigan, bueno, feliz de estar con ustedes acá nuevamente, y tengo una primicia que presentar ahora, antes de nuestro break. Sabemos que para todos nosotros la información pertinente y oportuna es muy valiosa para la toma de decisiones, no solo de nuestras áreas en las que nos desempeñamos cada uno, sino también en las recomendaciones que tenemos que entregar a nuestros clientes desde las agencias de medios. Por lo mismo, la asociación viene entregando mensualmente diferentes tipos de reportes de inversión, y a los reportes que tenemos actualmente le sumamos uno que cumple con responder la necesidad que nos han manifestado la mayoría de ustedes, sobre todo los avisadores, en tener la información mucho más depurada a nivel de industria. En los códigos QR que van a empezar a aparecer ahora en las pantallas, van a poder descargar un adelanto de este informe, un informe a nivel industrias, que fue construido por las agencias de medios y que obviamente la asociación, con una tecnología obviamente muy confidencial, resguarda toda la información que cada una de las agencias nos entrega. Este reporte lo componen 21 industrias con una radiografía detallada de los medios, las plataformas y cuáles son los canales digitales que son utilizados en cada una de estas industrias. Podrán revisarlo no solo en las pantallas que tienen a continuación, sino que a continuación en el break podrán descargarlo, revisarlo. Este informe es un beneficio para los socios de la asociación, así que los invito a los que aún no son socios que lo puedan descargar y puedan ver este adelanto. Como les comenté, es información a nivel industria, construida desde la inversión de las agencias de medios socias de nuestra gremial. Ese es el anuncio que tenemos. Volvemos en 20 minutos más. Quedan 2 speakers, Ian Whitaker y don José Miguel Ventura, así que los espero en 20 minutos, aquí mismo. Gracias.
Eso, la ola. Vamos. Buenos días. Ya no voy a decir buenas noches. Por favor, las personas que están entrando, cordialmente están invitados a tomar asiento. Vamos a comenzar la segunda parte de nuestro seminario. Pero antes, vamos a esperar ahí que las personas que están ahí conversando en el centro, no alcanzo a ver quiénes son, pueden tomar asiento, pueden pasar, por favor. Queremos partir, lo deberíamos haber hecho esto al principio, pero dicen que es mejor hacer las cosas que no hacerlas. Y queremos compartir con ustedes. La semana pasada tuvimos una triste noticia. Una triste noticia de un amigo, colega, compañero, un tremendo profesional, padre de 2 hijos, que nos dejó a los 43 años, una persona que disfrutó trabajando en esta industria, trabajó en distintas compañías, y su último trabajo fue como gerente general del grupo Copesa. Me refiero a Eugenio Chaguán. Simplemente quiero compartir con ustedes, somos nosotros una familia, nos toca convivir no solamente en este tipo de encuentros, sino que en el día a día entre las agencias competimos, los medios compiten, pero finalmente terminamos colaborando y trabajando en conjuntos como amigos, como colegas dentro de la misma industria. y siempre pensando en el bien común más que los intereses individuales de cada uno. Y Eugenio fue un tremendo luchador, una persona que siempre fue capaz de decir lo que pensaba. A veces se le salían sus insultos, sus garabatos, porque era muy apasionado. Apasionado en el fútbol, apasionado en el trabajo, y apasionado con su familia, apasionado en la vida. Y yo creo que es bueno también hacer un pequeño recordatorio de personas tan buenas y tan memorables como Eugenio Chaguán, por quien yo lo invito a hacer un aplauso más que un minuto de silencio por el gran Eugenio Chaguán. Muy bien. Así que gracias, Eugenio, por todo lo que nos dejaste también y por compartir este momento con todos nosotros, aunque no esté aquí físicamente. Ahora, un breve también momento en que algunas personas se nos acercaron y dijeron: queremos escuchar a Paulo y a Gloria. Queremos que nos compartan al menos unas palabras, qué es lo que sienten, qué es lo que piensan. Dos grandes y tremendos profesionales que dejaron un tremendo legado en el mundo de las comunicaciones, en el mundo del marketing, trabajaban con agencias, algunos decían que las agencias eran huevos con jamón, pero tremenda agencia y que tienen una tremenda trayectoria. Los queremos invitar, Gloria y Paulo, a los dos aquí al escenario para que nos puedan compartir algunas palabras y yo me callo. Eso. Muchas gracias. Bienvenidos.
Bueno, buenos días. Yo voy a decir buenos días. Buenas tardes ya. No, buenos días. Primero que todo, quiero agradecer a la Asociación de Agencias de Medios por este reconocimiento. La verdad es que ha sido una gratísima sorpresa cuando Gonzalo me contactó y dijo vamos a hacer esto por primera vez. Creo que es muy valioso hacerlo, reconocer a las personas que tienen amplia trayectoria. Cuando uno habla de trayectoria, en general, piensa en la cantidad de años. Y es cierto, ¿para qué los vamos a negar? De casi 30 años. Pero sí que uno lo vive. Yo puedo decir que ojalá mi trayectoria sea mirada por el legado, por los logros, por los aprendizajes que tuve todo ese tiempo trabajando en Copec. Y trabajé en marketing. En marketing trabajé mucho con las agencias de medios. Ha sido exquisito encontrarme con gente que tengo muchísimo cariño en este congreso. Y bueno, trabajar en marketing yo creo que es un tremendo desafío. La verdad es que nos exige muchísimo, muchísimo, nos demanda muchísimo tiempo, pero es tan fascinante que uno no se da cuenta. Yo que ya estoy afuera, haciendo otras cosas, miro para atrás y digo, ¿cómo podía hacerlo? Pero la verdad es que el día a día del marketing te lleva a eso. Cuando uno realmente le gusta, tiene tanta pasión por el marketing, por la marca, por la empresa que tuve el privilegio de trabajar, uno no se da cuenta de todo lo que entrega, pero tampoco se da cuenta de todo lo que aprende todos los días. Así que solo incentivar a que todos los que trabajan en marketing sigan con esa misma pasión, con el foco en el cliente, con permanente innovación. Y ojalá que más empresas hagan lo que decía Ian, de que vean a marketing como una inversión y no como un gasto, que es algo que uno lucha permanentemente cuando está como ejecutiva. Así que muchas gracias, Gonzalo, y a la asociación por este premio y aprovechemos lo que sigue de este congreso.
Hola, buenos días. Yo quería partir también dando las gracias al directorio por este reconocimiento y para mí de verdad es un honor, más aún recibirlo junto a Gloria, porque para mí por lo menos Gloria siempre fue el referente de un gerente de marketing, de innovación, de cómo construir una marca, cómo poner al cliente en el centro. Bueno, creo que Gloria se merece este reconocimiento y mucho más porque creo que tenemos la suerte en Chile de tener un profesional de la categoría de Gloria y todo lo que ha hecho por una marca que es referente para los chilenos. Así que nada, yo le pido un nuevo aplauso para Gloria porque creo que se lo merece. Y la verdad no había pensado en qué poderles transmitir, pero yo partí en una agencia de publicidad, yo partí como redactor, estuve en el área de cuentas Y a los 3 años de estar en agencia me llamaron a trabajar al Banco de Santiago, ya hace 30 años atrás. Y mi desafío cuando llegué al banco, que estaba lleno de gente que sabía mucho de bancos, yo siempre dije desde el primer día, yo no quiero aprender de bancos. Creo que lo que hace falta en las empresas primero es gente que sepa de marketing, que sepa del cliente, que sepa del consumidor, de sus necesidades, y que genere una relación entre las agencias y las empresas, los avisadores, que fuera con cariño y con amor. Suena raro, pero en estos 30 años creo que me tocó trabajar con pocas agencias de medio y con pocas agencias creativas. Creo que con Gonzalo nos conocemos hace muchísimos años porque trabajamos ¿cuántos años juntos? ¿20? 20 años. Y yo estoy convencido que cuando se genera un vínculo entre las agencias de medio, las agencias creativas y los avisadores, el resultado es infinitamente mayor a cuando hay una relación de proveedor. Para mí las agencias siempre fueron socios, fueron partners. Yo hasta el día de hoy insistía en que nos teníamos que juntar, ojalá todos los días, presencialmente, a conversar, a perder el tiempo, a tirar ideas. Creo que el resultado a la larga es muchísimo más rico cuando hay esa conexión entre las agencias y los avisadores. Por lo tanto, si yo tuviera que decir algo de estos 30 años, es haber construido ese vínculo como partners entre todos los que trabajamos alrededor del marketing. Eso, muchas gracias.
¿Vamos a cerrar? ¿O sigo? Bueno, vamos a seguir con el programa. De inmediato vamos a dar paso a la segunda conferencia de esta mañana, un reconocido marquetero inglés, conferencista, coach, presentador y facilitador en distintos cursos del rubro. Es director en Magic Numbers, consultora con más de una década de exitosa experiencia en marketing efectivo, analítica avanzada y storytelling. También es fundador de Relight, consultora en desarrollo personal y ejecutivo en torno a la eficacia del marketing. Entre los premios por sus contribuciones a la industria publicitaria se encuentran haber sido incluido en The Media Leaders Future 100 Media Leaders y ganador del Media Weeks categorías 30 y sub 30. Además, fue reconocido como Star Player en Campaign Magazine en los años 2022 y 2023. Invito a este escenario a Dayan Nicolás. Dayan, bienvenido.
Amazing. Wow, it's an absolute honor to be here. Can I just say that first and foremost, I'm going to grab the clicker to make sure that I'm doing this the right way. Yes, perfect. So I'm here to talk about, let's go back one. I'm here to talk about when's the right time to invest in brand and not just performance marketing. And why am I here specifically talking about this? Well, for over 10 years, that's what I've been working to understand. Not just this question, but the question of what works. What works when people invest in marketing? And I've done that through mostly being an analyst that's used a toolkit, used econometrics, which essentially means I've just built loads of models to understand the drivers of business. And today, what I have the opportunity to do is to share with you some insights that have come from econometric modeling. Because today I meet you and I work for a company called Magic Numbers or Magic Works. And so that's founded by Dr. Grace Kite. You can see her there in the picture. But what she's founded is a company that we have a mission. It's not just to just make models, that's great, but how can we generate insight that leads to change? How can we generate insight that means that marketers, advertisers are making better decisions for business? And so she created Magic Numbers, And also we have a parent company called Analytic Partners. Now this is a global company, so we'll see insights not just from our own data, but global data as well from the RI Genome Project, which is really exciting. And I promise you, I know I'm mentioning lots of data, but it will be very exciting just for different insights and the ways that we can cut it. And then last but certainly not least, magic works. So Grace believed in the power of data and insights so much and wanted to have a real impact on the marketing industry that she made courses. Essentially, that answers two really key questions. The how-to guide for marketing data, how do you present it? What do you do with it? How do you tell stories that lead to change? And then scaling up works, which is how to get the mix of performance and brand right. And so a lot of the insights today come from that course. And so as we go through, please, I invite you to be curious. And if you have any questions, come and find me afterwards. But what's the journey for today? Well, we're going to start off with, well, when is it time to change? Because what I'm not talking about is brand instead of performance. It's both. What I'm talking about is there's a point in time where it then becomes important to consider what brand can do for you. Resistance, I'm sure there's many of us that's had that conversation, let's invest in brand, and actually there's a bit of feedback that says actually now's not the right time. So what does that resistance look like? And what data can we use to support in getting through that resistance? Then we'll talk a bit around, well, what if you don't do brand building? What are the other options? And there's a really common option that a lot of advertisers and brands do. Good first steps in a new direction. So great, you've got brand, you want to take the first steps. Well, what do you do? I'm going to introduce a model that we use for people taking first steps that helps you identify this is the activity that you should choose. And then we'll wrap up with a bit around brand building changing. The way that people consume media, especially brand-type media, is changing, so we need to lean into that. And last but not least, measurement. How do we measure it? What does that look like? So getting into it, time to change. When is that? But first of all, the question that really comes to mind is, well, am I even spending enough? And so we did a bit of analysis, the ARC database. So that's our database of over 500 brands, UK advertisers, for billions of pounds worth of spend. And the question we wanted to say was, well, actually, if I'm starting off, what's a good place to start from? And so along the x-axis, you have media budget as percentage of turnover, or your revenue as a business. And on the y-axis, you have return on spend. And so what we looked at was, well, actually, where does ROI begin to peak? And what we found, and this was across all businesses, but also mainly businesses that sell online, it peaks around 5%. So spending about 5% is a great place to start. Now, you're probably thinking, is this just a UK-centric thing? This is UK data. So Grace, our founder, looked into it and wanted to corroborate it with other data sources. And so it corroborates with Paul Dyson's work that looks into the same thing, that 5% seems to be a general rule of thumb. And remembering, this is a general rule of thumb. But also, there was a global study by Nielsen in 2022 that reaffirmed the same thing at a global level. So let's dig into that a little bit. So what we have here in the dark purple is the percentage of media spend, and you can see they're all well below the 5%. And then in the pinker circles, we have an ROI index. And what's really encouraging is we're seeing that same pattern, that everyone's spending well below what they need to, right? But also, actually, where we see it closer to that 5%, we see that ROI index start to increase. And so this is another global finding, and this is specifically for FMCG and CPG. But when we did our analysis, we're finding across all. This is a significant finding and understanding that most people are underspending, and when you're spending closer to that amount, you're getting those higher ROIs. But is it all about spending brand? Because actually, there's a point in time when actually performance is the best thing to do. And before we move on to that, we have the understanding that actually the way in which we're thinking about media, last click is really misattributing results. So this is a bit of analysis from our parent company, Analytic Partners, so at a global level. And we've compared the results that we get from last click, what's the last thing that someone clicks on, versus econometrics, which says which touch point actually caused that sale. And we can see last click attribution is overestimating paid search. And it underestimates things like brand TV and DRTV. And so what we have here is two really big questions. One, are we spending enough? And it's probably unlikely given that most of the world isn't. And two, are we spending on the right things? But when you're smaller, actually spending a lot on search makes sense. Because actually, this is back from the ARC database, and what we have here on the left is smaller businesses with less than a £1.50 ROI, and then on the right, when they achieve greater than a £1.50 ROI, what's the optimal budget? And we can see when you're a bit smaller, you favour a little bit more PPC, a lot more social, and a little bit less TV versus your average. And that's because when you're smaller, you're tapping into your demand, and there's enough demand for you to tap into that you don't need to go to broader reach channels. And so what I really want to introduce next is this concept of demand and thinking about demand, because that really tells us what the role of the channels are to do. And so I wanted to introduce this model. So what we have here is the demand pools model. And on the furthest side, the grey, you have what we call category demand. These are people that are at some point in category and thinking about purchasing something. So for me, it might look like purchasing a sofa, let's say, because that's got a longer consideration window. But they're unaware and not ready to buy right now. So let's say I want to purchase this in September. So I'm in the category demand, but I'm not ready to purchase right now. And so from a marketer's perspective, these are people that are interested. They've got a high intent, but not to purchase right now. Then as we go across, in the green, we have your category demand. So this is your particular brand. These people are amenable to buy from you right now, and they're in market. They want to purchase right now. You might have seen this in slightly different ways. So in the B2B, it's commonly referenced as, say, the 95%, 5% rule. 5% of people are in market, 95% of people are out. But the job of marketing is to move people from the left to the right. And so what we have here is from the green over to your customers, we want to call those demand harvesting channels. These are people already in category that want to purchase, and the job of media there is to convert them through to a customer. And so the typical channels you might see there are your paid search and your social. And here I'm using the language of demand harvesting, but you might call it performance, or you might call it activation. And then the other thing that we can do is build demand. And so that's what we're doing when we're building from our grey category demand into our demand pool itself. And that's done a bit differently, because that's done by doing demand building activities such as TV, video, posters. And so what we can see is two really clear roles for media: one to harvest that demand once it's there, and one to build that demand and build that demand pool. But the thing is, your demand pool can be fished, right? That's the job of performance activity demand harvesting. The job is to say, okay, there's this much people in market that want to buy from us and don't necessarily want to buy from a competitor. Take that out. And so here what we can see is actually they've invested in enough performance marketing or demand harvesting for about a third of the people in market. And it's converted to that many customers. And that's great when you're starting off and when you're scaling and you're building your business, then there's lots of interest in your category. But what happens when you start to invest more in demand harvesting is that actually it gets harder to convert them into customers. And that's because we might be reaching people that are closer to your competitors and want to buy from them, or they're just harder to reach and they cost more money to target. And so what we can see is now we're reaching almost 4/5 of the market itself, but it's only converted into about 1.5 extra customers. And so from an analytics perspective, what we're going to see there is declining cost per click, declining cost per acquisitions. And so it begs the question, well, what can we do about this? But also another really important thing about the demand pool itself is that it can be impacted by external events. And so we saw this during COVID, but we've also seen it recently during the world economy. Actually, your demand pool can shrink because actually there's less people interested in you because actually they're considering more goods that are just necessary because things are costing more. And so what we really want to do is understand how do we get control of this demand pool, because it's going to shrink for reasons that we can't control, but also conversely grow. And as we begin to harvest more demand, it's going to get tougher and tougher to be able to reach people. And so that's where the role of brand advertising comes in. Here's a quote of what happens and what it feels like when the world's shrinking and when you're over-investing too much. And so it's your cost per click goes up significantly, so your cost per engagement goes up significantly, and you're getting over your target cost per acquisition. and everything's becoming inefficient. I'm sure we've all been there. That's what it looks like. That's what it feels like. And then there's a sense of, well, what do we do? There's this doom loop of actually, okay, now we need to invest more in this channel, but we're not seeing it pay the returns. And so the thing to do is to understand that this is a typical life stage. So this is a model that was made by Dr. Grace Kite and one of her close friends. And what it shows, it's called the performance plateau. It's a typical stage of a business. And what we have here, what I was describing, is when you're growing, it's great. We're tapping into that demand. We're fishing the pool. It's super efficient. It's super effective. Then we start to hit what is called a performance plateau. And in that performance plateau, it looks exactly like what we were talking about, those cost per clicks rising, the cost per acquisition rising, everything looks like it's failing. And here, what Tom Roach and Dr. Grace Kite found was that actually the way to get off of this is to invest in demand building activity. And what you can see is actually you don't just get an uplift in the yellow, which is your demand building activity's impact on sales, but you also get an uplift of your performance marketing activity. And I'll talk to you a bit around why that happens in a moment. But this isn't a model of the world, right? This isn't necessarily real data. So we wanted to show you some real data, which looks at something that we've analyzed ourselves to say that this is real, this is what we're seeing. So this is from an econometric model. And it's something that we see time and time again. And what you can see is that exact same pattern. We're seeing that growth, great. That performance marketing was really working well, doing the good job whilst we're a bit smaller. Then it started to plateau. Then what we can see is as we started to do our TV activity, there's an uplift in the always-on digital as well as the TV. That's interesting, right? But also, this effect is something that we can use to demonstrate why brand building is a win for everyone, not just for brand building, it's a win for marketing as well, which I'll talk about in a bit. And so, what I invite you to start thinking about next is actually, if we want to grow and we want to build our demand pool, we need to invest in demand building activity. And so we're there, right? Everyone's on this journey with me right now. We're ready to invest in brand building, but there's resistance. And that resistance might look a little like this. I spoke to him about brand building. He was like, yeah, not trying to do what you want to do. I don't want to become a household name. I don't want to be famous. I want to put £1 in and get £50 back. I'm sure this is something we've heard time and time again. I want the money. And the thing is that actually it's really important because that's what we're here. Ian said it earlier, the job of marketing to do is to help grow businesses. And so it's important we speak in that language and we're speaking in a way that's talking about that. But the thing is, brand building does exactly that. And so what I want to offer is some language, some tools and some charts that demonstrates, well, how is brand building helping? Especially if you don't just have econometrics right off the bat. And so there's a few ways that it helps your performance marketing team. One, lots and lots of visits on your way to them, cheap on the way to you. And I'll show you a bit what that looks like. It gets you off the performance plateau, as we saw in that chart. And so actually it helps re-energize your sales from a brand uplift, but also from making your performance marketing work better. And that's point 3, your search marketing works better. And I'll tell you a bit around why that actually happens. So first and foremost is actually so to explain this is from a study. And along the x-axis is your brand reputation score out of 10. And so essentially, that brand reputation score is correlated with your investment in brand activity. As you invest in more, then that typically grows. And what we can see is as your brand reputation or investment in brand goes up, you can see your click-through rate on paid search goes up as well. And so this is a really important finding because actually when we're starting to have those conversations internally, we can start to say, look, this is a both thing. It's not one or the other. We can see there's a bit of a dip down when it's like that large, 8+. And the reason, if there's analysts in the room, it's like, why does it go down? The reason that we think that is because once you're that size, you probably have more organic and direct traffic. So that's just to add a bit more flavor why we're seeing that pattern. Then the algorithms respond. So we've spoken a bit around the top one. So you do demand building and you get more direct traffic. So lots of people on their way to you. But also, because actually demand building, you're seeing the higher click-through rate, the algorithm sees that as an increased quality. And so actually, you're able to generate a lower cost per click and the algorithms will work more favorably for you as well. And so what we're really talking about from brand activity really is this win-win, where it's making your performance activity work harder because by the very nature, it's driving reach, which is driving people and traffic through to your site and through to ultimately sales. And then, last but certainly not least, we wanted to bring this to life with a case study. Now, it's difficult to think of Airbnb because they're a global giant business of ever being quite small, but there was a stage where they launched and they were really small. And how they grew was to really increase their number of listings and depend on their search activity. And so what they were doing was increasing their different pools by increasing their listings and investing in lots of different search activity to support that. But then actually we get to around about 2019 and we start to see that strategy is not working anymore. The growth that they were experiencing is not the growth that they needed to grow. And so actually what we see from their CFO, which you can see a bit above, is that they had to change their approach. They had to start investing in brand and they made a shift into it because, and that's why it's important to say this isn't just a scaling strategy, this is for mature business as well, because those strategies just no longer worked. And so they needed to explore a new strategy, and what they decided was investing in that brand strategy was the most appropriate thing to do. But we know from them that actually they invested in different demand pools, right? And so they invested in expanding their listings. And so actually what we can see is when they did it, their marketing costs went down. They had a 20% uplift in their direct traffic. But they used other methods. And so it's not to say that this is the only way, and we wanted to spend some time exploring, well, how else do you grow your brand? And so there's other ways. One of the primary ways that we see advertisers doing is looking at your range. So this is taking it now, thinking on just a product level. And we're imagining that there's an advertiser here, the sofa seller again, and they're selling their sofas. And here we have the launch and the time since launch. And this is, again, what we see regularly. So you can look at your own data as well, right, to try and see this launch, not just in econometrics, which is really interesting. And so what we can see is that that started to reach a plateau on the chart on the left. On the chart of the right is year-on-year growth. And what we're seeing here is that actually we're seeing declines in that. And that's showing us that actually we're starting to reach a plateau, both of them together. And so a way to get off of that plateau, well, is to think, well, we know lots around the keywords for sofas, let's say. We've got lots of expertise in this. Maybe we could find an adjacent demand pool, maybe chairs. Oh, and it's back. So yeah, maybe chairs. And so what we have here is another way of getting off that plateau. So what we can see is actually we've invested in it, and then it started to plateau again. But actually for that time period, we've achieved that much growth. And so actually it's another way, and it's a typical way that we see advertising do, is expanding the product range, and we can see that there again. But ultimately, what you can see from this, and hopefully we're all arriving at the same place, is that we still keep reaching this plateau. We still keep reaching that place. And this is a conception, right? But actually this happens in real life as well. And so bringing that into life a bit, ASOS, as seen on screen. So this is a global e-retailer, clothing retailer. And actually, when they started back in the year 2000, it was as seen on screen. And actually, they were selling items from movies and selling that as a product. So you'd see a T-shirt in a movie, and they'd actually sell it, or a wallet. And that was their thing. They quickly realized that actually they needed to expand their range because they reached a plateau in all of that. And so they started expanding into just general clothing retailer. Then another way to expand your demand pools is to go into different markets. And so what they did was to expand into the USA, Germany. And so what we're seeing is they're constantly trying to understand that source of growth. But what we saw in 2015, as we saw in that conception before, is that actually they kept reaching the plateau. And what we saw is that actually they realized that they'd invested too much into performance marketing activity at a global level. Their CMO said something, a new CMO came in to diagnose what the problem was, and they said, we spent too long investing about 80% into our performance marketing and focusing on the people buying right now. And we haven't focused on the people out of market to make sure that we're growing our baseline. That's like more or less what they said. And so what we saw, and you can see from this headline, is that they made a decision to rebalance and invest into brand activity. And so what I'm affirming here is that it's not just one thing. It's to say that this is a complementary strategy. But once your other levers start to work, this is absolutely a direction that's important for growth. And that many businesses, I've showed two today, but there's plenty of other examples of how others have reached that same conclusion because they're not investing for growth for tomorrow. And so what do you do? Okay, great. We're all on board. We're going to invest in brand. We're starting off with 5%. But how do we take those first steps? Well, what Grace did was she interviewed a bunch of practitioners and used our own data and came up with a conceptual model of how you could take those first steps. And it has 2 axes. Essentially, you can target low-cost visits. So is your audience easy to reach at low-cost times? Or you can target reach. And the thing with media, it's really difficult to do both of those things at once, because actually once you start reaching everyone, there's harder people to reach. And then also on the y-axis, you can make an ad that's memorable, or you can make an ad that's informative. And so each of these different quadrants represents a different type of client. And so if you are a client that is just making some first steps, ready to scale, then actually you might want to be in the bottom left-hand quadrant. Because actually you should be here if you have an innovative new product, people are interested in it, it's a low-ticket item, and it has short purchase cycles. So actually you don't need a memorable ad, you need something that's informative right now. And actually you need to ensure that the audience is available at cheap times. But what if you don't have a new product that's super exciting, that has an audience available at cheap times? What if actually there's a lot of competition? Well, this is where you need to target reach. Because actually when you work in a highly competitive environment, well, you need to scale fast. And that's what we see with lots of these large scaling brands, right? They're investing heavily in brand media because actually they need to fend off the competition. And what they can get away with is an informative ad. Because it has a low ticket price, you just need to really tell people, this is what we do, you really want to get it. But for many of us, and the So, for example, included, having an ad that's informative isn't simply enough. Also, it's a high ticket item. It might mean that actually there's a long purchase cycle. And so what we might be is in this top right-hand quadrant, or top left-hand. And so it's a high ticket price, long purchase cycle, and the competition's fierce. That's where you need to make an ad that targets reach, but also that's super memorable. Because actually, if that person's not in market at that time, when they are ready to purchase and in that green demand pool, you need to be top of mind. And especially when we're thinking about brands that are more mature, that's a lot of time where we're sitting, where there's fierce competition and perhaps longer purchase cycles. And so you really need to be investing in channels that are targeting reach and that are memorable. And realistically, when we're thinking about that, that is more leaning towards our demand building channels as opposed to our demand harvesting channels. So you're ready to invest. But how? You've got a bit of performance, you've got a bit of brand. What's the correct split? And there's been lots of work to understand this. This is from one of the most famous ones, especially in the UK, of Binet and Field. And so what they did, we have a similar institution, ours is the IPA, the Institute of Practicing Advertisers, and they looked at 1,000 cases of winning papers. And they looked at them and they said, okay, in these papers, what is the general split between performance and brand? And what they found was actually the optimum for the largest effects that you observe in a campaign is around about 60-40. Building demand, so brand building, 60%, versus 40% demand harvesting. Now, this is an incredible finding that sent shockwaves through the advertising industry. And actually, after this, in terms of the papers that were put through in the IPA, they were focused on short-termism, like effects of less than 6 months for a long time. And after this was released, across the years, you saw actually long-term thinking was massively much more invested in. So it's really interesting to see how findings like this can change the way that people think, the way that people plan. But naturally, as analysts, we were curious because these are award-winning campaigns, right? And so what we did was to look at our own database, the ARC database that we saw earlier on, to say, okay, let's have a think of our data. And our data is normal campaigns as well. It's not just award-winning campaigns. And so we looked at this in a couple ways. But before that, this is just says that this is their data split across different categories. And so if you want to know what the split is, that's the average, the all 60-40. But it's different for perishables versus financial services. But what we did was to look at our own data. And so what we have on the chart on the left is basically our total data sample. You can see 572 advertisers there. And we've split them between they're mostly online or they're mostly physical. And what you can see is when we don't factor in high performing ROI, we can see it's 55% for mostly online and around about 70% for mostly physical. But when we go into the chart over here, when we start to adjust it, we start to see a really similar view of around about 65% demand building and around about 35% demand harvesting. Now, that's 2 data points, right? That suggests that actually we should be investing in this mix in demand building to be able to maximize our returns, to maximize our growth. But we wanted to give a slightly different flavor as well, because obviously this is quite UK-centric. And so what we looked at as well as another data source is the analytics partner's RI genome. So our parent company has been collecting analysis from over 40 countries and billions of pounds worth of spend for the last 20 years. And what we're looking at here is a cut of the data that says, okay, looking at performance, when I'm looking at campaigns that are performance only versus equity only, so are equivalent to our demand building, versus performance and equity, what difference do I see in return on investment? And actually what we see is, actually there's a range. Typically, when you move from a performance-only strategy to a performance and equity strategy, there's a range around 25% to 100% increase in ROI. But when you look at median ROI, we can see that actually there's a 90% increase in median ROI when moving from a performance-only to a mixed approach. So this is global data. This is something that we're not just seeing in the UK and seeing in UK data, we're seeing at a global level. And so actually this is also powerful because when we're talking about this with businesses, with CFOs, with CFOs, it's a business decision, right? It's not just this is a great way to build a brand. This is actually a great way to improve our returns. This is a great way to grow our business. And so hopefully those are 3 different insights of, well, how do you actually do that? You spend the minimum 5%, you start there, you test it, you decide what your strategy is, and then you decide your optimal mix. And of course, I encourage you all to test what your optimal mix is. In this case, it says a minimum of around 30%, and then we've seen around 65%, and so there's lots of different data points to test your own strategies as well. But brand building is changing. And what do I mean by that? I'm being intentionally ominous and mysterious. And what I mean by that is, there was a world where there was just one screen that dominated our viewing behavior. And it's still very important, let me just be honest there, it's very important, but it's now diversified. And the way in which that we consume brand, videos, sound on, that experience is very different now. And it's important for us to consider that actually it might be absorbed in multiple ways. And so when I'm speaking about brand building, yes, TV is a part of it, but it's actually all video. And actually what we have coming up next is some research that suggests that actually by diversifying your mix, you can actually improve your returns on your investment, which is really exciting. And so from an attention perspective, we know that video is great at capturing attention. The chart on the left is the percentage of time sitting with an ad spend actually looking at it. And naturally, as you go to TV, this is from Ubiquity and Lumen, as you go to TV is a high percentage of that. But also online video is just a high percentage of that. And so when we're thinking of brand building, we begin to think of video experiences. What video experiences can we have? And so the chart on the right, the longevity of sales effects. So this is us looking at our data. And it says, okay, over what duration would I expect to see this impact lasting? And we can see that for TV, it's about 6.5 months. And so 6.5 months after that TV has aired, it's still having an impact. And then it's around 4.6 for online video and display. Now, this is quite powerful, actually, because when we start to think about it, actually, it's really important to think it's not just sales for today, it's sales for tomorrow. If we were to look at those figures for our paid search and our performance marketing channels, that would be a lot lower because they're designed to have a short-term and immediate uplift. A bit later on, I go into a bit more detail around about, well, what do those uplifts look like when we have performance marketing versus demand marketing, and how do analysts see it? But here you can see a representation of those longevity of effects. So it's really important that we're affirming this message that it's not just today, it's also tomorrow. But TV's not the only way. There's other routes as well. This is a piece of data that's just looking at trust of influencers. And across the board, I'm not going to go through it, but people trust the recommendations from the creators they follow. This is saying that on average around 72 to 73% is a high trust environment. And so brand building just doesn't necessarily look like how we think it looks like back in the day where it's mainly TV. Now it's a combination of multiple things, lots of littles. And when we're thinking about those lots of littles planning, actually, this is a model again. What we find and what we pick up in our models is that actually when you combine different media channels, there's a synergistic impact. And so what we can see here, you have the impact from the individual channels, but you have the impact of them combined together. And we were able to look at this and quantify this in a couple ways. And so first, what we were able to find with the analytic partners data, this is global, when you use the additional payback for using 5 channels versus 1 is up to 35%. So that's what they measure at a global level. At a UK level, using our ARC database, we measure that up to 65%. And Kantar, and this is the thing about this, the brand impact, is almost double. And so there's 2 things. There's the diversification of channels, but also the thing that actually, because attention is skewed, what is it, 2.5 seconds to get someone's attention, actually now it's lots of littles. So it might be a bit of video over here, a bit of TV, and that has powerful planning implications of when we're thinking about the right mix between brand and performance as well. But context is super important, and that's what the other charts suggest. Actually, we need to make sure that when we're showing up in lots of these different places, there's cohesion. A way we like to talk about it at Magic Numbers HQ is the luggage needs to match. It needs to all be from the same set. So when you see a brand in one place, it needs to show up in another place and look consistent as well. And that just doesn't come from us, that comes from loads of different people working in a creative space as well. And so what we have is what the right amount to invest, what the right mix should be. So we want 60-40, maybe start there, or 65-35%, making sure that we have a mixed campaign. Then we're going to have multiple channels that are doing it so we can get those additional effects. And then we're going to make sure the luggage is matching. But how are we going to measure it? And that's where econometrics comes in. Now, when we're looking at those online touch points, you can see there that last click attribution, it considers the last touch point that happened. And that's very much comparing to that chart I showed earlier on. Now, there are other attribution methods, right, that look to understand more than just the last click. But ultimately, if they don't have visibility of it, i.e. online touch point, it can still miss the mark. And so econometrics, what econometrics is doing is looking across all touch points. It focuses on marketing ones here, but it's also looking at your seasonality, the economy, what your price was. It's holistic. And by understanding all of the different touch points, it's able to tell you what was the true impact of marketing. Not only just that, it's able to communicate in the language of the CFO. Well, what did that do for the business? And that's ultimately what we're trying to do, is actually take all those influences and say what it is. Also, by looking at non-marketing factors, actually you're able to have conversations around price. That price conversation that Ian was talking about, actually, what is our price elasticity? Has it changed since we started doing brand advertising? What is the impact of the economy? And so you can see, you can start to facilitate as a marketer different conversations with the business and help bring those relationships in with the businesses. These are the types of questions that you can answer from econometrics. It's just a selection, but it might look like justifying your spends. How do you allocate across media channels? It does this in a really cool way where actually, over time, we're going to understand the impact of marketing, and we do that at a channel level. But what we're also able to understand is, at what point does that channel start to work less hard than it did before? At what spend level? And by doing that, we're able to understand what is the diminishing returns of each channel. And that helps us understand what the optimal spend should be. How should we allocate that? So like when we saw that chart earlier on that says, this is the right mix, what is the mix that's going to maximize ROI? Another powerful implication is forecasting. So the ability to take that information and to the point what Ian was saying earlier on, think about those inputs and create robust forecasts to say, this is what we've inputted, these are the assumptions, this is what's come from the model, this is what we believe, this is how we hit our goal. So we can start talking about effectiveness rather than just about efficiency, driving down the ROI. Actually, how do we reach our goals with marketing as the lever to reach them? And then also you have things like the external drivers, the economy, etc. Bulletproof evidence if you're writing awards. And also another really powerful one as well is to quantify the impact of brand. And so another powerful insight is not just looking at the short term, is to understand actually, by improving my consideration, has that had an impact on driving my baseline? And so you've got that understanding of sales over here, but also the understanding of how driving brand, driving interest, driving positive perceptions can drive your business as well, and combining those together to create a short-term and a long-term view. So that's how we can start to get underneath it. And I said earlier on that we kind of see these two bits of data in different ways, and analysts, we test the response over time. And we see two broad shapes from these two different types of activity. And so the one on the left is our demand harvesting activity. And what we can typically see, and what you'll typically see in your dashboards, is that short-term uplift. But these are the weeks you can see by the end of the 13th week that effect is gone. But because you can see that short-term uplift more noticeably, the businesses, they love it. Then on the one on the right, the sales from demand building. And what we can see is there's still a short-term uplift. It's not that there's no short-term uplift, but it's less nuanced. But what we have is the slow decay over time. And so to that point of where that 6.5 months came from, is from measuring the average of effects like this that we see. It's saying, on average, when we see that effect decay, it lasts that long. And again, this has more important clarifications for business as well when we're talking. Actually, it's not just about sales today, it's about sales tomorrow. And so when we're thinking of our channels, typically, when we split between demand harvesting and demand building, these are the typical channels that fall underneath that. And again, there's some flex in between the two, right? Because actually you can have some video in your paid search and paid social environment. So it's not a hard and fast, they can behave in different ways, but broadly speaking, our demand harvesting is our paid search, our paid social, our paid Instagram, our radio. And then when we're thinking of those demand building, it's that brand TV. Remembering that brand TV might live and breathe differently today versus yesterday. That might be video somewhere. It's your YouTube and your online video. It's your sponsorship, it's your BVOD and your out of home. And so when we're thinking of, I want to make those first steps, I want to invest 60-40, this hopefully offers some language as to what would fit into there. But naturally, this will be different for each and every brand. And again, if you want to have a chat about that, let me know. And so thinking about today, if you want a copy of the presentation, please scan the QR code. It will take you through to a link. But I just want to thank you because actually it's really important for us to have this conversation. We find it really exciting. And it comes from this notion that actually we are the ones that can support the growth of our clients' businesses by investing and allocating effectively to maximize returns. And hopefully from today we've explored, well, when is it the time to make those first steps? When you're starting to see that performance plateau, what you should invest, starting with that 5%, how you should invest, investing 65%, 35% as a start, and then a bit around how to measure it. So thank you very much. If you have any questions afterwards, let me know.
Le damos las gracias a Toshan por su presentación. Y según lo programado, pasamos inmediatamente a la conferencia de nuestro tercer y último conferencista en Media Day. Nuestro único representante nacional es socio fundador. Un aplauso. Bueno, él es socio fundador de la consultora La Vulca, ingeniero comercial, estadístico y licenciado en matemáticas. Actualmente es asesor de empresas, miembro del Círculo de Marketing de ICARE y docente en la Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. En nuestro país ha sido distinguido como el mejor investigador de mercado de Chile, mejor consultor de marcas, varias distinciones, mejor director de consultoría de marcas, siendo además la primera y única persona en obtener 3 veces el premio de Marketing Best. Dejo con ustedes a José Miguel Ventura. Muchas gracias, José Miguel.
Muchas gracias. Ya, a ver. Tengo 2 desafíos súper grandes. Primero, tener que cerrar el evento, después de 2 tremendos presentadores, ser la única persona chilena. Así que traje mucha información nueva, que no han visto nunca. Así que espero que les guste. Y lo segundo, para quienes me conocen, es, lejos el más difícil, hablar solamente 15 minutos. Voy a tratar, les juro, los que me conocen, voy a tratar. Así que tengan listos los celulares para sacar fotos, para tener ahí la presentación. Igual después, saben, nos pueden llamar, se las vamos a compartir. Es bien difícil, porque después de lo que nos dijeron, el cómo somos valientes en los tiempos donde las métricas probablemente son distintas, son nuevas, pero tienen que tener un objetivo, que es poner en valor al marketing. Y para poder entender eso, quise traer data que no hemos visto. De hecho, las primeras láminas vamos a hablar del barómetro del marketing, que sale en un par de semanas más, pero que nos van a servir para poder tener un poco de contexto. Y hay contextos que pueden parecer muy leves, pero que cambian radicalmente el panorama de lo que hacemos y del marketing en Chile. Y el primer cambio es que tenemos que empezar a considerar un enfoque de género en la industria de marketing. ¿Y saben por qué? Porque hoy día la mayoría de los que trabajamos en marketing en Chile, tanto clientes como las personas de las agencias, somos hombres. Pero por primera vez en nuestra historia nos enfrentamos a que la mayoría de nuestros clientes son mujeres. Y eso cambia radicalmente el cómo nos tenemos que enfrentar. Cambia radicalmente el cómo tenemos que atender, ¿o no? Estábamos acostumbrados probablemente a una dinámica bien brusca. Estábamos acostumbrados a hacer las cosas como siempre fueron. Y esto es un cambio, y un cambio de paradigma grande. Por ahí se acuerdan de una campaña en el metro, ¿no? Hace varios años atrás. Yo creo que eso es parte de la enseñanza. Pero también hay cambios en la estructura de la inversión. Y siempre hemos estado en esta lista, ¿se han dado cuenta, no? Digital con off. Y sí, es claro, digital viene creciendo. Digital, de hecho, cuando se les preguntan a los avisadores cómo distribuyen su presupuesto, si lo hacemos en suma 100, entre digital y offline, claramente digital se está llevando el 60% del gasto en Chile. Pero hay una tercera fuente. Y que de repente no nos dimos cuenta y se metió. Y hoy día, de repente, tenemos una cosa que se llama BTL, que se está llevando un cuarto de la inversión publicitaria hoy día en Chile. Y eso es un cambio. El cliente está declarando que hace BTL. Y es interesante porque el BTL no le viene sacando plata al off, le viene sacando plata digital. Y ojo con eso también, porque es un cambio gigante. Y ya que estamos en el mundo y en el evento de las agencias de medios, es un cambio gigante para cómo distribuir también ese gasto. Y también hay otras señales que son súper relevantes también de considerar en el mercado chileno. Como por ejemplo, cuando en el mismo barómetro les preguntamos hoy día a los clientes cuáles son los atributos que más necesitan al momento de decidir qué hacer con sus marcas a través de sus proveedores, todos nosotros que somos proveedores de marketing que estamos acá, es bien interesante porque los únicos atributos que aumentan con respecto al año anterior están relacionados con conocer más los negocios, están relacionados con el mejorar el branding, muy en línea con lo que veíamos recién, están relacionados con estar más metidos en la estrategia del negocio. Pero lo que más crece con respecto al año pasado está en lo relativo a la creatividad. Y eso yo creo que va muy en línea con el calce que teníamos que hacer para entender la dinámica entre marca y performance. Y entendiendo el contexto leve, pero de cosas que son cruciales que cambiaron, nos enfrentamos también a ciertas opiniones que nuestros clientes, muchos de los avisadores que están acá, también sienten que están pasando. Y hoy día, por ejemplo, solamente un 33% de los avisadores declaran que tienen su mix ideal de servicios de marketing. Nos queda harta pega, ¿no?, por hacer. Harto que mejorar. Un no despreciable 43% declara que tenemos que cambiar el modelo de servicio. Todos los que somos proveedores tenemos que atender diferente, porque cambió desde quién nos recibe en la oficina hasta cómo hoy día se mueven las inversiones. Pero también, que yo lo encuentro bajo, solamente un 38% de los clientes dice que siente que todas las agencias trabajamos en línea, comunicadas en pro de los objetivos que ellos tienen. Y nos falta el coordinarnos, ¿no? El dejar a lo mejor de ver medios, creatividad, consultoría, PR, investigación de mercado de forma separada. Y tenemos que trabajar para integrar los servicios en pro de quien nos paga los servicios, ¿no? Y un no despreciable 40% también de los clientes, en línea con lo que veíamos recién, dice que su trabajo se enfoca básicamente hoy día en performance. Solamente, de hecho, un 29% están en desacuerdo con eso. Y eso también da cuenta de cómo el cliente se está sintiendo. Y hay cosas que también van generando y van metiéndole más pelos a la sopa, ¿o no? No sé si vieron por ahí los resultados de la última encuesta de Gartner. ¿Cierto? ¿Qué opinan los CFOs y los CEOs del trabajo de los CMOs, de los gerentes de marketing? Y es complicado. 45% de los directores de marketing no superan las expectativas de sus directivos, aun cuando lleguen a las metas. Y es terrible el cómo hoy día nos están juzgando. 27% de los directores de marketing supera las expectativas que tienen los directores generales y los directores financieros de ellos. Un peligroso 54% indica que hay una suerte de falta de respeto de los pares y que eso produce el despido de los CMOs. O sea que los pares en la misma empresa no valoran el trabajo que los marqueteros hacen y que eso es una fuente para ocasionar el cambio de un CMO. Es fuerte ese dato. Y el 38% de los CEO y de los CFOs opina que los gerentes de marketing logran colaborar con otros ejecutivos. Solo un 38%. Entonces tenemos pega, ¿no? Está difícil la mano. Y podríamos decir que eso es como la tormenta perfecta hoy día. El escenario en el que nos movemos está difícil. Y en escenario difícil nos paralizamos. Y en escenario difícil nos ponemos conservadores. Y en escenarios que son complicados nos ponemos cobardes. Y esta falta de valentía, al final, se ejemplifica en dos cosas muy puntuales, que lo vimos por ahí en un estudio que hicimos a los Marketing Best en Chile, con Valora, en que nos dan dos temores principalmente. Nos empiezan a dar miedo las métricas y nos empiezan a dar miedo el no ser capaces de compartir un lenguaje de negocio con nuestros pares dentro de nuestras compañías. ¿Le agarramos miedo a los CFO? Le agarramos miedo a los CEO. Entonces, se empiezan a generar dudas. Dudas basales, como por ejemplo, ¿cómo medimos lo que se hace en marketing? Y eso va a la interna, pero también va hacia nuestras agencias, ¿o no? ¿Cómo medimos la efectividad de lo que nuestras agencias hacen? ¿Cómo yo como agencia pongo en valor lo que hago para los clientes? ¿Qué métricas son las que tengo que elegir? ¿Qué métricas son las que me conviene usar? Casi siempre terminamos usando las donde salimos bien parados, que no necesariamente son las que deberíamos tener, porque si no nos vamos a pegar un balazo en el pie. Y también es importante entender quién tiene la responsabilidad de sugerir cada una de las métricas que vamos a usar. Porque nuestro día a día es complejo, pero no somos capaces de saber todo de todos los temas. Y si tenemos un set de agencias trabajando para nosotros que hoy día, aparte se siente que no es el óptimo como mix y que no se comunican entre ellas, lo que los clientes están esperando es que también sean capaces de entregarnos métricas para ayudarnos en la gestión. Y esto yo creo que queda claro en las dos presentaciones que vimos en la mañana, ¿no? El cómo incorporamos al marketing en la evaluación financiera de la empresa. ¿Cómo ponemos en valor, por lo tanto, el impacto de lo que hacemos en los resultados del negocio? Y ojo, que eso no necesariamente es hablar de campañas de marketing. Es probablemente algo que tiene que hacer que quienes trabajamos en marketing empecemos a hablar de ventas, de logística, de distribución, de almacenaje, de CX, de postventa, de cómo generamos flujos. Y no solamente de awareness o de bonding, que nos quedamos de repente pegados ahí porque nos acomodan esas métricas. Entonces estas dudas probablemente nos llevan a uno de los desafíos más grandes que hemos enfrentado desde que trabajamos en marketing. A mi modo de ver, y muy personalmente creo, que nunca había sido tan difícil trabajar en marketing como hoy. Es difícil, ¿no? Hay tanto para hacer, tantos medios que usar, tantas métricas que conocer, a tantas personas que satisfacer, tantos segmentos que se han creado. Es tremendamente difícil hoy día trabajar. Entonces, ¿cómo salimos de esta cuestión? ¿Cómo nos movemos para poder enfrentarlo? Y yo creo que hay que entender ciertas cosas primero para poder salir. Primero, tenemos que entender que tenemos que hacer que el marketing se perciba como una inversión. Pero eso es quizás lo más fácil. Más difícil es traducir esa inversión en impactos que sean concretos y medibles. Y por ende, debemos aprender en algún momento a ser capaces de medir el retorno de la inversión en marketing. Porque si nos quedamos pegados en el performance que estamos hoy día, estamos cosechando ventas para hoy día. Pero tenemos que acordarnos de que la marca, como nos mostraron en las dos presentaciones anteriores, son las ventas de mañana. Y eso, como en algún momento mencioné en ICAR el año pasado, no sé si se acuerdan algunos que estuvieron ahí, nos permite y nos debe y nos genera hacer un cambio de paradigma, ¿no? Porque si la estructura de incentivos de nosotros es trimestral, vamos a estar pensando solamente en las ventas de hoy. Y eso también requiere de un cambio. Si nos da miedo equivocarnos porque nos miden por lo que pasa en el día a día, es imposible que innovemos. Es imposible que encontremos una estructura para ir corrigiendo errores y para atrevernos a hacer cosas diferentes. Entonces, todos esos cambios de paradigma son claves. ¿Por qué? Porque el foco de este seminario es eso, ¿no? Darle valor al marketing. Poner en valor al marketing frente a nuestros pares, a nuestras agencias y a nuestras audiencias, ¿o no? Entonces, ¿cómo salimos? Lo primero, creo que tenemos que empezar a medir nuestras marcas. Pero ya las medimos, ¿no? Sí, medimos top of mind, hacemos funnels. Pero tenemos que incluir mediciones de los riesgos en los cuales nuestras marcas están. Y eso involucra entender los mundos, contextos y negocios en los cuales nuestras marcas están. Y por ende tenemos que aprender a sopesar estos riesgos. Lo segundo es que tenemos que lograr equilibrar nuestros horizontes con las acciones. Les Binet y Peter Thiel lo vienen diciendo hace 20 años, ¿o no? Y seguimos sin aprender. Y seguimos en la misma dinámica. Y entender que no es necesariamente una pugna de performance y branding. Es de cuánto tiempo más queremos que nuestras marcas estén vivas. ¿Puro performance? Perfecto. 5 años de marca. ¿Puro branding? Probablemente también. ¿Cómo sopesamos esos horizontes para que las marcas vivan mucho más tiempo? También tenemos que transformar al marketing en la voz real de nuestros targets. Dentro de las empresas, principalmente, donde la principal tarea de esa es de los gerentes de marketing. El gerente de marketing debe ser el que más conoce al target de la compañía. Debe serlo. Pero debe estar apoyado, ¿o no? Y todos los que somos agencias deberíamos también proveer la información correcta en el momento correcto para que el gerente de marketing pueda complementar su visión. Porque probablemente las agencias sí conocemos mejor las audiencias. O sí podemos tener más condiciones para leer los contextos. O sí podemos, por ejemplo, ponernos en los cambios de comportamiento de las personas. Pero tenemos que trabajar juntos. Y ya para ir cerrando, esto no lo dije yo, lo dijo Peter Drucker. En toda historia de éxito, siempre se encuentra alguien que toma una decisión valiente, ¿no? Y en momentos complejos, de contingencias, de incertidumbre, esta cuestión cuesta, ¿o no? Entonces la invitación es súper simple. Tenemos que ser valientes. Pero tenemos que ser valientes ahora, porque si no, no vamos a ser útiles mañana. Esa es la invitación. Muchas, pero muchas gracias por la invitación.
Muchas gracias, José Miguel. Bueno, de esta forma estamos llegando al final de la segunda versión de AN Media Day, organizado por la Asociación de Agencias de Medios. Yo me despido agradeciéndole la posibilidad de conducir este interesante seminario y será hasta el próximo año. Que tengan un excelente lunes. Adiós.